Welcome to the Lupina Center's lecture tonight with Stanley Hauerwas. My name is John Berkman. I am the director of the Lupina Center for Spirituality, Healthcare, and Ethics, a center committed to thinking through the interrelationships between spirituality, healthcare, and ethics, and how thinking through those issues might help us better serve the health needs of the people of the province of Ontario, and hopefully get wider than that. I want to say just a couple things before we get going tonight. First, Crux Books has been wonderful about advertising and publicizing the event for us, and they have a books table with many of Stanley Hauerwas' books. So I encourage you all after the lecture to, on your way to the reception, which is in the other part of Regis College, to stop by and visit them and see what they have for you there. And the other thing I'm asking is if everybody, before they leave, could fill out this feedback form. The Lupina Center will be extraordinarily grateful for that. When I was a first-year doctoral student at Duke University 25 years ago, the graduate program in religion there had a doctoral seminar for the graduate students. It was not an academic seminar per se, that is, where faculty might come and speak about their intellectual interests and research. Rather, it was a seminar where faculty shared their life stories as academics, about how they came to do what they do. It was a seminar, actually, I believe, that Stanley Hauerwas, when he was the director of the graduate program in religion, had inaugurated. And the stories the faculty told were fascinating. One scholar of Islam, a man by the name of Bruce Lawrence, talked about how as a freshman undergraduate at Princeton, he wanted to study Chinese. But it turned out it conflicted with his ROTC commitment, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, and so he had to take Arabic instead. And that kind of changed his life, that schedule conflict as a freshman undergraduate. And in examples of his and almost every other faculty member who spoke, I learned of the sheer contingency of much of the lives of my professors. And one of the things that taught me as I went along is what I might otherwise have thought to be curious or interesting, Stanley Hauerwas has taught me to see as God's working in my life. That's one of the many ways God calls me in my life. Now, there's little, I suppose, I can tell you about Stanley Hauerwas that you can't read by Googling him. In fact, you could probably do it on your smartphone while I'm speaking, and be done before I finish speaking. But you can't Google my relationship with Stanley. And since Stanley has shaped my life and helped me to see how God has worked in strange ways in my life, perhaps I can introduce Stanley by briefly telling you a little bit about that. I was a University of Toronto undergraduate in my third year studying philosophical ethics back in the mid-1980s. And I was trying to integrate that with my evangelical Presbyterian faith when I got to spend a year studying in Oxford. The one evangelical Protestant doing theology there was Oliver O'Donovan, and I was trying to make sense of his book, Resurrection and Moral Order. In that book, O'Donovan mentions two ethicists he thought were particularly important, John Finnis and Stanley Hauerwas. And so while I was there in Oxford studying Wittgenstein, if you're going to study any philosophy in Oxford, you have to study Wittgenstein, and I managed to take up one of Professor O'Donovan's suggestions by doing some tutorials with Dr. Finnis there. So then I returned to finish my undergrad at the University of Toronto, and I had two professors, Ronald Wiener and Joseph Boyle, as two of my teachers. And in various conversations with Professor Wiener, Professor Boyle, and with Professor O'Donovan about my future studying ethics as a Christian, all three of them kept mentioning the name Stanley Hauerwas as someone I needed to study with. And if you know anything about Professors Wiener, Professor Boyle, and Professor O'Donovan, you know they had very different perspectives on almost every question imaginable. So it was particularly, I couldn't figure out how this could be happening. So I applied to Duke. And in spring of 1987, I was back studying with and working for Professor O'Donovan in England, when I got a call from my mother. Stanley Hauerwas had called her looking for me. To my surprise, she then proceeded to tell me all about Stanley. Now, as it turned out, as part of a Bible study that year, she had described the evangelical magazine Christianity Today. And the previous week's issue had featured a story on Hauerwas with a big picture of him in the middle of the page. And she had just finished reading the article about Stanley when the phone rang, and there he was on the phone. I don't even know if she knew I was applying to study with her. So she called me at Oxford and told me to call him. So I called him, and Stanley told me Duke had a scholarship for me. Meanwhile, Professor Donovan had secured for me a place to study at Worcester College with a young theologian named Tom Wright, and I was having the time of my life at Oxford. I really wanted to stay, probably for all of the wrong reasons. I asked Stanley if I could defer my acceptance. He said no. So I talked to Oliver Donovan, and he said that he had just been at Duke, and there was a wonderful group of graduate students, and that I should go there. I was shocked. I was so excited about staying at Oxford doing a degree. I figured my mom, with a certain Anglophily, would be keen for me to stay there, as well as Professor Donovan, who worked to secure a future for me there. But they were all keen on my going to study with Hauerwas, as had been my teachers, Wiener and Boyle, so I said goodbye to Oxford. I knew I was going to a whole new world, I just knew nothing about it. Not only did I not know where Durham, North Carolina was, I didn't know where North Carolina was. And shortly after I arrived at Duke, I entered the class of Stanley's to find 22 doctoral students sitting around the room. And I thought, I'll be lost. And Stanley was away a lot that fall, so I really wasn't seeing much of him. Finally, I had an appointment with him, and he told me that at the previous year, his home situation had been so bad that he accepted every speaking engagement he was offered. And now he was having to fulfill them all, that he was excited to have me there, and he would be there for me. And for the next 5 years, Stanley was there for me in ways I could not have imagined. He always had an incredible amount of time for me, and for the rest of his doctoral students, and always had time to ask not only about my work, but about my life, how I was doing. He'd ask me what papers I was writing for other courses. I would give them to him, and he'd have them back to me the next day with comments on them. He took an interest in all of my education. He regularly introduced me to those he was corresponding with, introducing me to the whole of the world I was about to enter. I could not have imagined a better or more generous mentor to me. And whenever I think about my job as a teacher, I try to think of Stanley. I know I'm not half a teacher as he was to those students I work with, but I certainly take him as my model. But what do I take from all of this? Stanley taught me that in order to live faithfully as a follower of Jesus, I need to think about and see the world differently than I typically do. That I can see what otherwise would be sheer contingency and an accident is in fact to see God's guidance in my life. To see that what might seem to be the ordinary or trivial is not, but is indeed where God speaks to us. And tonight, Stanley will speak to us of how we might see and welcome God into those difficult aspects of our lives, times of loneliness and suffering, and to see in them God's presence and grace. It's not a lesson easily learned, and I repeatedly forget it. So I'm glad to have Stanley in our midst tonight to remind us of this and much more. Let's welcome Stanley Hauerwas.
It's a great honor to be here. It's wonderful to be with John and Jennifer. Obviously, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to have so many wonderful graduate students come in and take over my life. It's very interesting. As you look back over your work, you can almost see the graduate student that's come through and said, have you read that? And you hadn't. And so you had to read it, and you learn, and you write differently. The title of this is called Suffering Presence 25 Years Later. The title of the talk intentionally mimics an essay I wrote some time ago entitled The Narrative Turn, 30 Years Later. In the essay on narrative, I revisited the general theme so determinative of how I think, that is, the knowledge of God and knowledge of the self is best displayed through narratives. I used the opportunity to assess the turn to narrative in order to distance myself from what I thought were some of the doubtful apologetic and popular uses of so-called story theology. In particular, I worried that the emphasis upon story could reproduce habits associated with foundational theological projects that too often result in anthropological reductive accounts of theological claims. If that's too much to take in, just think Protestant liberalism. I was not then, nor am I now, suggesting that I think attention to narrative for displaying the grammar of theological work to be mistaken, but rather I meant only to remind myself and those influenced by what I had said about narrative that theological appeals to narrative is not an end in itself. Suffering Presence, Theological Reflections on Medicine, the Mentally Handicapped, and the Church was published in 1986. I'm going to use this opportunity to write about the relation of theology and medicine, to look again at what I was trying to do in that book. I wish I could say that this retrospective look back to the publication of the book was meant to serve the same purpose of my essay about narrative theology. That is, to counter some of the enthusiasm engendered by the publication of that book 25 years ago. But Suffering Presence is a book that, as far as I can judge, fell stillborn from the press. That it did so is not surprising. After all, I was trying to challenge some of the dominant paradigms associated with the development of medical ethics. From my perspective, the development of medical ethics was but a legitimating discourse to underwrite, as Joel Schumann would later argue in a more sustained way, the transformation of medicine into an industry that is in the business of selling an especially desirable product, namely health. I say at one time, princes surrounded themselves with priests in order to provide legitimation to what they wanted to do. Now physicians surround themselves with ethicists to provide themselves with legitimation for what they want to do. I mean, it's the same process. I risk being self-indulgent by directing attention to my past work, but by doing so, I hope to suggest that there is a connection between the narrative turn and how the relation of theology and medicine should be understood. By making explicit some of the intuitions that informed what I was trying to do 25 years ago, I hope I can say better now what I had tried to say then about how the body that is subject of illness and death is a storied body. That it is so, moreover, means that any attempt to care for the body that fails to so recognize its storied character cannot help but distort the gesture of presence called medicine. By developing this understanding of the body, I hope it may help us say better what role a person's faith makes for responding to illness and the care and healing of the ill. But that is not my primary interest. I'm sure the religious convictions patients and physicians bring to their encounters can and sometimes do make a difference for the character of those interactions. I have no doubt that prayer can and does make a difference when we are ill. I worry, however, that to emphasize the difference that prayer makes may lead to our forgetting that prayer has been given to us not to make a difference even when we're sick, but in order that we might acknowledge the difference God has made by choosing to be our God. My subject, therefore, is not the difference religion can make for the recovery of illness. Rather, I understand my task to be a normative one. That is, I want to try to say how Christians should care for one another through the office of medicine. My argument assumes, using the title of Wendell Berry's wonderful chapter, Health is Membership, in his book, Another Turn of the Crank, that health is just that, namely membership in a community. Berry's insights about health as membership may seem like much he has to say, a commonplace, but I hope to show it is a commonplace that is a deep challenge to the practice of contemporary medicine. For medicine as a practice in advanced societies like the United States and Canada cannot acknowledge that it reflects the material conditions of any particular community. The irony, of course, is that medicine does reflect the material conditions of a particular community, It is a community dominated by economic and political ideologies that claim to be first and foremost about securing the freedom of the individual. As a consequence, anonymity becomes a way of life, and as a result, many of our interactions with one another cannot help but be manipulative. In a world in which it is assumed we share no goods in common, medicine cannot help but seem to be but another impersonal institution that delivers services to consumers. Ironically, a medicine so determined cannot acknowledge the body, which allegedly is the subject of medical arts, is a storied body. For a storied body is not the body of anyone, but the body determined by a particular history of a particular community. If the body is appropriately understood as a storied body, Berry argues that no hard and fast distinction can be drawn between the physical and the spiritual. That we currently make that distinction, according to Berry, only reflects how an understanding of the body as a machine has come to dominate our lives, and in particular, medical care. As a result, Berry describes the contemporary hospital as a place where the world of love meets the world of efficiency, that is, the world of specialization, machinery, abstract procedures, in a manner that those worlds are relegated to separate spheres. At best, love can be expressed in such a context primarily as the attempt to get the best medical care available, but the best medical care available is not determined by a community of love. These are complex matters that easily invite misunderstanding. Suffering Presence was written before I'd read Berry, but I think it quite compatible with Berry's understanding of health as membership. For example, in Suffering Presence, I argued that the medicine is an office of a community in which some are set aside to be present to the sick, even when they cannot cure the person who is sick. I should like to think that understanding of the role of medicine to be quite similar to the way that Berry depicts the mutual responsibilities of the physician and the patient. I've been criticized for allegedly assuming a far too idealized account of medicine. I understand the worry because such a view of medicine seems to have little relation to the reality of medical care currently practiced. I was not, however, trying to suggest that we must find a way to recover the medicine practiced by the, quote, small-town physician. The medicine we have is the medicine we have. Modern medicine can be quite brutal, but so could the medicine of the small-town physician. It is my judgment, however, that the actual practice of medicine, even a medicine determined by the demands of efficiency, is often much more humane than it is given credit. That Berry understands health to be a concept that draws on a more determinative sense of community, however, is the reason his reflections on illness are formed by stories. Berry remains far, by the way, is Wendell Berry known in Canada? I mean, I certainly, I mean, great, super. I suddenly realized, Wendell is a poet, novelist, farmer in Kentucky who I believe is one of the wisest people we have in America today. Berry remains far too close to the ground, he's a farmer, to forget that no matter what we may say about who we really are is most determinatively indicated by our bodies in relationship to other bodies. For Berry, when our bodies are abstracted from our communities that constitute the trust and love that give life, we have an exemplification of an abstract understanding of the body that can only be destructive. A body so determined may invite a concern about spirituality when the body needs to be healed. But a spirituality and religion divorced from the actual practices that shape the body threatens to be far too generic to do any serious work if serious work is understood to be the work of Christian theology. Health may even be more ambiguous term than spirituality. But when health is thought to name total well-being, as it's often done in modernity, and medicine becomes the agency of health so understood, this threatens to make medicine the institution of secular salvation. I suspect that's why, for many today, medicine has become an alternative church. I try to help people appreciate why medicine is such a morally compelling project by asking them to think about the difference between seminarians and medical students in terms of moral formation, because medical school is where people are really morally formed today. I mean, a person can come to divinity school today, and they're usually someone who's failed in another line of work before they get there. And after, but that's good. God's good with failures. And after a semester or so, they can say something like, you know, I'm just really not interested in Christology this year. I'm really interested in relating. I'd like to take some more clinical pastoral education. And unfortunately, many divinity schools, they say, right, wounded healer, we've read Henry now, and blah, 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 blah. Go do CPE or something. A kid in medical school after a semester or a year can say, I'm just really not interested in anatomy this year. I'm really interested in relating. I'd like to take some more psychiatry, which goes to show they don't know dip about psychiatry since it's all biochemistry now. What they're told is, we don't care what you're interested in, kid, you know, and they are a kid. Take anatomy or ship out. Now, that's real moral formation. Now, why is it that medical schools are so much more interesting morally than divinity schools? I think the answer is very simple. No one believes an inadequately trained priest may damage their salvation, but people do believe an inadequately trained doctor can hurt them. And so, just to the extent that most people today care more about who their doctor is and who their priest is you have a sense of how we all live lives of practical atheism. I mean, that's just the way it works. And of course, the reason, of course, is I oftentimes ask lay audiences, that is, audiences that are not immediately associated with medicine, how they want to die. You want to die quickly, painlessly, in your sleep without being a burden, right? You don't want to be a burden because you don't trust your children. You want to die painlessly, quickly, and in your sleep because when you die, you don't have to know you're dying. So now we ask physicians to keep us alive to the point that when we die, we don't have to know we're dying, and then we get to blame physicians for keeping us alive to no point. But it's a wonderful double-bind game. But exactly that, and of course that increased medical costs and that kind of thing. But that's exactly the reason that, see, at one time, there's even a prayer in the Great Litany of the Book of Common Prayer, which every Catholic should be required to read. I mean, after all, you need to learn good language somewhere. Elegant prose, there's no substitute for. But there is the prayer in the Great Litany to save us from a sudden death. Why did Christians pray to be saved from a sudden death? Because what they feared was not death; they feared God, and they wanted to have time to reconcile themselves with their enemies, who of course were their family, and God. What we fear is not God, we fear death. And so exactly what that does is we take out great drafts in the hope that medicine can keep us alive to the point that when we die, we don't have to know we're dying. This assessment formed the background for the case I tried to develop in Suffering Presence, where I called for the practice of medicine that subordinated medical care to the determinative ends of the church. Of course, the church with which I was principally concerned was the Church of Jesus Christ. The emphasis on the body as the proper subject of medical care and suffering presence was an attempt to suggest why a church must exist if the care we provide to one another through the office of medicine is to be kept within appropriate limits. Well, I think that emphasis is needed in my attempt to highlight the hubris of modern medicine. I failed to say enough about the body that is the proper subject of medicine. That hubris, that is, the presumption that through medicine we can get out of life alive, is not the fault of physicians. Rather, that expectation, admittedly an expectation that physicians and researchers have encouraged and from which they have benefited, is carried by patients who are anything but patient. Ironically, the spiritualization of the body, a denial of the finite character that is our body, a denial often legitimated by Christian beliefs, means that the body patients ask physicians to care for is not the body shaped by the body of Christ. I wrote Suffering Presence, therefore, in an effort to remind us that medical ethics is not a disciplined mode of reflection for how physicians should act toward patients. For I take it that medicine names not only what physicians do, but rather is a determinative interaction between doctor and patient. The focus on patients for determining how we should think about the ends of medicines, therefore, was at the heart of the fundamental perspective I tried to develop in Suffering Presence. We will not get a more modest medicine in service to the body until we recognize that as patients, for good or ill, we get the medicine we deserve. I always say, if you want to understand the United States, all you have to do is look at who we elect to Congress and what kind of medical practice we produce. I mean, that comes from us, not physicians. Let me try to explain this last remark by suggesting some of the problems that currently seem to bedevil communications between patients and physicians. It is often forgotten that physicians are human beings. Because physicians are human beings, they, like their patients, would like to be liked. Translated into the grammar of medicine, the desire to be liked means physicians would like to help those who are sick and seek their help. This desire becomes problematic when the patient has been formed to expect cures that the physician cannot honestly provide. The sick seek out the physician because they rightly think a physician knows what needs to be known to help them and can do what needs to be done to make what is threatening them less threatening. The problem is quite simply that, given the reality physicians confront on a daily basis, they know what the patients know, but best do not want to acknowledge. That is, when it's all said and done, we're going to be dead. Patients, however, often do not or cannot acknowledge that reality, and as a result, subject physicians to expectations that cannot be met. The tension between what the patient expects and what the physician can do is complicated by the recognition that at least one aspect of the therapy a physician represents is the trust the patient has in the physician. If the physician seems to be in doubt about what is wrong with the patient, even more what might be an appropriate intervention, patients can feel betrayed, making it even more difficult for the physician to speak truthfully to their patient. I mean, and you must remember that when a physician is trained, they're told over and over again, when in doubt, don't act. When in doubt, don't act. But there's a terrible pressure to act, because if they don't act, the patient thinks they don't care about me. This is complicated by the vast differences that education, class, gender, and race present for communication between physician and patient. When you write, as I do, a book like Suffering Presence, you think you're writing primarily for highly educated people who assume that most patients a physician deals with will be like them, that is, highly educated. But physicians do not care only for the highly educated. They also care for people who do not know what blood pressure is. Yet the physician, at least in theory, is obligated to care for a patient no matter what their educational level or race may be. Medicine, for all of its problems, remains an extraordinarily morally formed practice. That is why, in Suffering Presence, I suggested that the very idea that physicians needed to be taught ethics to sustain their work only leads to a distortion of the ethics that constitutes the physician's work. Fundamental to that ethic is the presumption that a physician is to care for a patient before them in a manner that transcends all other considerations. Think about that. A physician is to care for the patient before them in a manner that transcends all other considerations. This may be a vile child molester, but if they've got a bad gallbladder, you care for them. I mean, think about what an extraordinary moral commitment that is. That commitment I take to be at the heart of the trust that should characterize the relation between a physician and a patient. The patient must have the confidence that the care they are receiving will not be subject to considerations of what they can pay, what another patient may need, or whether the physician does or does not like them. So the physician is caught. They must care for the patient in a manner commensurate with their training and skills, but the patient may well not appreciate the limits of what the physician can do. The account of medicine I provided in Suffering Presence was meant to be a response to the unhappy state of affairs by developing an account of authority that legitimated the physician's care of another human being, even when that care cannot cure. I developed that suggestion by calling attention to what I called the authority of the body. I even suggested that by focusing on the body, I was exploring a kind of natural law reasoning shaped by our bodily character. For at least one of the aspects we share as human beings is that we are bodily. Moreover, that we are bodies makes possible the interaction necessary to discover the goods we have in common. To be sure, those goods are mediated by traditions that are diverse and often in conflict. But to the extent we share in having bodies means we have some basis for mutual recognition. Accordingly, I argued that medicine is the name for a tradition of wisdom concerning good care of the body. As such, it is not a means to health, but rather is part of the activity of health, an activity that involves as much participation of the patient as the physician. I mean, it's absolutely crucial to understand the activity of medicine, that every time a patient presents to the physician, they're giving that physician a gift. Just to the extent that you are willing to expose the vulnerability of your body to the physician has an opportunity to learn from the vulnerability of your body what they can say to another patient who has the same vulnerabilities. Medicine is an empirics that is learned over time through our willingness to have our bodies exposed to the physician in a way that that exposure can be of help to another human being. The body sets a norm for medicine because the body is classically understood as the artist of its own healing. The task of those in medicine is to aid us in living through our bodies because it is a mistake I fear that may ironically be characteristic of the celebration of the body in modernity to try to live beyond our bodies. In Suffering Presence, I argued that in contrast to such an understanding of the body, medicine is therefore best understood as an ongoing tradition of wisdom and practice through which physicians acquire the responsibility to remember, learn, and pass on the skills of learning to live with a body destined to death. To sustain medicine so understood, requires a community that is capable of resisting the seduction of what I can only characterize as the Gnosticism of modernity. The focus on the body, a body that is not simply a physical body but a lived body, was my attempt to show how physician and patients alike share a common good that could at once limit as well as legitimate physician intervention. By calling attention to how the body can act as an authority, I sought a way to help physician and patient to discover a common language, making communication possible. In particular, I commended Eric Cassell's account of the physician's task to first and foremost to educate their patients to acknowledge their bodies. I continue to think I was on the right track by directing attention to the body as the locus for the kind of discourse necessary to legitimate the work of medicine. But I confess I was trying to have my cake and eat it too. I was trying to show how the body can provide the necessary limit to our desires for escaping finitude, while also suggesting the difference Christian formation makes for the care we provide for one another through the office of medicine. Because I believe that to be a Christian is the fullest expression of what it means to be a human being, I do not think these two emphases necessarily are in tension. But given the imperative of the Baconian project, we cannot assume the body Christians believe is a gift from God is the same body that often shapes patients' expectations toward medicine. Jeffrey Bishop, for example, argues in his recent book, The Anticipatory Corpse, Medicine, Power, and the Care of the Dying, that the body that determines the care provided by modern medicine, interestingly enough, is the corpse. That medical students' encounter with their first patient is an encounter with a corpse, Bishop takes to be a sign of how the body is generally understood in medicine. According to Bishop, at least since Bacon, it has been assumed that the body, like the world itself, is essentially without purpose other than our ability to impose on it arbitrary desires. The body is therefore understood as a malleable object subject only to instrumental causation. Given this mechanistic understanding of life, Bishop argues that the care, particularly of the dying, provided by modern medicine, is built on a metaphysics of efficient causation made possible by the epistemological assumption that true knowledge of the body is knowledge of the dead body. In contrast, knowledge of a lived body, a body that to be sure is transitory, makes a science of medicine difficult because a lived body is an unpredictable body. We oftentimes forget, as Paul Ramsey argued in his great book, The Patient as Person, that the subject of the healer's art is not the disease, but the patient. And that, therefore, Mrs. Smith's gallbladder and Mr. Jones' gallbladder, both equally diseased, may be very different gallbladders. And what you do with them may be very different because it's Mr. Jones and Mrs. Smith. This is why Bishop suggests that the body presupposed by research medicine is the dead body, because the dead body makes possible predictable knowledge. See, one of the great problems for physicians is exactly because their care is for the patient, is how unpredictable it is of what you do for one patient that works fine. You may do exactly the same for the next patient, and it doesn't work fine, exactly because we're so different. Bishop concludes, quote, that the dead body is the measure of medicine, creating the sense that life is primarily a matter of moving efficiently within a space. Such movement is not only within the space of the body itself, but also within the space of the body politic. I'm sure many may think Bishop has overstated his argument. Surely the body that is at the center of medical care is the lived body. After all, the subject of medical art is not the body, but the bodily patient. The body that the patient presents to the physician, moreover, is a storied body that physicians soon learn they must listen to if they are to care for the patient. Yet it is surely the case that there is a tension between the science of the body presumed by research medicine and the everyday practice of medicine. I mean, that's a really important suggestion, that there is a deep tension between the science of the body presumed by research medicine and the everyday practice of medicine. Jerome Groopman illustrates that tension by calling attention to Dr. Myron Flachuk's observation that patients come to him as a specialist who is able to perform a procedure using a specialized technology. The technology is vital for caring for the patient, but Flachuk observes, I believe that this technology also has taken us away from the patient's story. And once you remove yourself from the patient's story, you no longer are truly a doctor. Increasingly, medical specialization may be an indication that the body that shapes medical care is, as Bishop maintains, a dead body. For a lived body means that there is no way to avoid judgment about patients that may prove to be mistaken. I mean, medical specialization is driven sometimes by science, but it's also driven by the presumption that if you know more and more about less and less, you're less likely to make a mistake. Because the relationship between the physician and the patient, the physician doing the best procedure assumed may hurt you, and they haven't done anything wrong, but it may hurt you. And that's just very hard for patients to get, that practicing the best medicine you know may hurt you. So specialization becomes a way, the more and more you perform the same procedure, the better you get at it. But if you are, if you're a gastroenterologist, you may miss the fact that they have, once I was in a course on taking histories at the Medical College of Texas in Galveston. And the way they take histories there, taking history is one of the most important things physicians do in order to make a diagnosis. And they hired actors to come in with certain symptoms. And this young man came in, and this young resident was interviewing him, and he said, well, what seems to be the problem? He says, I'm having these terrible migraine headaches. And the young doctor said, well, are you under any particular stress? And he said, yes, I'm a teacher in the local middle school, and our principal has just retired, and I'm going to be my name is being put forward to be principal. And the young doctor said, well, what's wrong with that? That seems good. And the young man said, well, the problem is I'm gay, and there'll be an investigation, and I'm in the closet here in Galveston, and I moved to Houston to act out. And he said, and so I'm terribly afraid that I'll be outed. And the young doctor, he was probably from El Paso, pushed his chair back about a foot and said, well, you know, there's nothing wrong with being gay today. I mean, it's just an alternative lifestyle. And so you don't need to worry about it, and so on. So he gave him a medication for depression and sent him to the shrink. And the head of the class asked the young doctor, he said, I noticed you didn't give him a physical. Why was that? And he said, well, I just thought it was clear what was wrong with him. He said, you know, even gay people have brain tumors. Now, I mean, I mean, that's how medicine is taught. It's taught through an extended care of teaching people to have appropriate attention. And oftentimes specialization can train you out of what it is you should see. The uncertainty associated with primary care may be one of the reasons that many physicians try to avoid that specialty. But specialization serves only to give those in the diverse specializations of medicine a false sense of certainty, because specialization can result in a failure to see the patient. To be able to see the patient, one has to listen to the patient. As specializations increasingly correspond to technological developments, specializations also occasion both critical and constructive reflection on the physician-patient relationship as it's affected by technology. Many fear that technology contributes to a further distancing between doctor and patient. But as Gawande observes, that compassion and technology are not incompatible and may even be mutually reinforcing. The machine may make mistakes less likely, and he notes nothing is more disruptive of the relation between a patient and a doctor than a mistake. Of course, as Gawande acknowledges, machines can and do make mistakes, but as systems take on more technical work of medicine, technologies can free physicians to embrace dimensions of care that matter prior to the development of technology, such as something as simple as talking to their patients. To talk to patients is necessary because, as he puts it, medical care is about our life and death. And we have always needed doctors to help us understand what is happening and why, what is possible and what is not, in the increasingly tangled web of experts and expert systems. A doctor has an even greater obligation to serve as a knowledgeable guide and confidant. Maybe machines can decide, but we still need doctors to heal. Gawande is right. We do need doctors to heal. But if Bishop is also right, then the healing that physicians provide may be determined by an understanding of the body that is in tension with the lived body of the patient. Therefore, I think it important to say explicitly what I only hinted at in Suffering Presence. If the Christian body is first and foremost a body meant to glorify God, then Christians must begin to contemplate that the kind of medicine that should characterize the Christian body may be quite different from that which does not share the practices of the church. In short, I think Christians may well find that they will need to develop a medicine that reflects the Christian difference. For the body the church presents to be cared for is not the isolated body of strangers, but the baptized body of the people of God. That body, the baptized body, is shaped by practices carried by the story of God, in which illnesses, suffering, death are not regarded as the ultimate enemy. They cannot be regarded as the ultimate enemy because Christians believe that even our suffering can be a gift that makes more intimate our relation to God and one another. I indicated above that the body that presents itself to a physician is a lived body. A lived body is a storied body. That is why my earlier essay on narrative is relevant to the case I tried to make in Suffering Presence. Our bodies demand habituation through which we acquire, as Aristotle argued, a second nature. If brought up rightly, that nature makes possible the acquisition of the habits we call the virtues. How the virtues and their interrelation are understood reflect the stories that shape the fundamental practices of the communities in which we live. For Christians, health itself is a virtue that makes possible our presence to one another in health, sickness, and suffering. Health, like all virtues, is thus a reflection of the love of God. See, I mean, as Christians, health is not something we just naturally want because we need to stay alive. But health is our obligation we have to one another in the baptized body to want to be present. And that may oftentimes be an ill, healthy body. Indeed, a Christian view of health does not deny that some among us are sick and will need care. Rather, a Christian view of health requires that the community recognize illness so that the one who is sick may be restored to health, but more importantly, so that the one who is sick remains part of the community even if their health is not restored. This means that the Christian view of health forms patients who want to be cured but not seeking the cure at all cost. Indeed, what the patient wants more than anything is presence. In other words, the Christian view of health entails the understanding that the Christian difference means being at peace with human finitude and even seeing human finitude as gift. Conversely, Christian health also means it may be appropriate for Christians to hold one another accountable when choices are being made that negatively affect one's health, such that they are inhibited from participating fully in service to God and the world. From this perspective, Christian health doesn't mean the absence of illness, but reliance on Christ and his community, the church, even when facing the realities of illness and death. It is this faithfulness to Christ that marks the difference of Christian suffering and is but a response to Christ's faithfulness to us. Even in the midst of his own suffering, like Christ, Christians must learn how to suffer without losing hope. We must learn to pray for our physicians, not only that they might have knowledge to help us, but they must have courage to tell us when they cannot. Even more, we must learn to forgive them when they lack the courage. And finally, we must learn to sit with one another in the valley of the shadow of death. By suggesting we need to attend to the Christian difference, I'm not trying to argue that difference is an end in itself. Rather, I'm suggesting that the Christian difference should determine how Christians understand the role and office of medicine. As I argued in Suffering Presence, for a community to set aside some to be with the sick is an extraordinary gesture that draws on the profound sense of the significance of presence to one another as a defining mark of the church. That presence, moreover, is made possible through a shared language, the language of the body, that makes communication between the doctor and the patient possible. I do not mean to suggest that the formation of physicians by the church would restrict them to only caring for Christians. But if a Christian doctor believes they must speak truthfully to their patient, non-Christians might begin to worry whether they want a doctor who is a Christian. This is not simply because a physician who is a Christian will not perform an abortion or entertain the possibility of euthanasia. Those kinds of concerns certainly matter. But I'm suggesting more than this. If health is membership, and in particular membership in the church, the very isolation that the doctor-patient relation too often enacts has to be reconsidered. Formed by the presumption of modern medicine, I fear that the way Christians pray indicates that too often very little difference between how Christians approach illness than non-Christians. The God whom we pray when we are ill, I fear too often, is the God of the gaps. That is, the God to whom we pray is a deistic God who exists, it seems, to be an insurance policy to protect us from the unknown. But that God cannot be the one who came in the flesh so that we not despise our flesh that beckons our deaths. The God we worship as Christians taught us to pray, "Thy will be done." We even believe that the Holy Spirit prays on our behalf when in the face of suffering we're unable to pray for ourselves. I'm suggesting that the Christian difference means our prayers are not determined by the valley of the shadow of death, but rather they're determined by the presence of the one who walks with us. The story that determines the Christian body is the story of Emmanuel, God with us. This is a story we were baptized into, which means we've already died. Therefore, the hope we share is ultimately not a hope to get through life unscathed, but rather a hope to remain faithful until the end. It is the hope of the resurrection. A medicine understood as an office of such a community called church means the "and" between theology and medicine cannot represent two quite distinct activities that must now be related. Rather, the and indicates the task of the church to be the kind of community that can sustain the care of bodies we share through the office of medicine. Illness usually comes as an unexpected guest, threatening to disorder our routines and make our lives incoherent. The stories that constitute our lives are meant to give us a sense of control and to assure us we know where we are and in what time we live. Yet the stories that we may actually be living may not be the ones we think we are living, but our illusions are dear to us. Illness often destroys our illusions as well as our confidence that we are in control. To be a Christian is to undergo the training necessary to know how to live out of control. According to Suffer Those That Suffer bonds those who are currently not sick to those who are sick through a common story, making possible the acknowledgement that even the suffering of those we love cannot separate us from the love of God. A medical care shaped by such a people does not need to promise cure to have the authority of legitimacy. The care of one another in the name of medicine does not even need to promise restoration. Rather, what such a medicine promise, the trust it instills, is to reflect through its care of the sick the story into which we were baptized. Such a community may be capable of supporting physicians who can tell us that they have no idea what may be wrong with us, but they will not abandon us. Such a community may be capable of sustaining physicians who are able to acknowledge that practicing the best medicine they know, they will sometimes make a mistake. Such a community is able to sustain a practice of medicine so conceived because patient and physician alike have been made participants in the common story. As Christians can be in continuity with the everyday reality of church life. For the everyday reality of church life is to participate in the worship of God in the process to discover the storied character of our lives in baptism. We have been given what we need, but we can lose what we have been given as Christians because we've been captured by other narratives that tempt us to describe our lives in terms foreign to the gospel. In his memoir, The Pastor, Eugene Peterson provides an account of the formation of a congregation that suggests what I'm trying to imagine can be possible. Peterson, who had not intended to be a pastor, found himself in the process of starting a new church. He soon discovered that he had no idea who would show up from one Sunday to another Sunday. Not all who came stayed, but as the church grew, he observed something like a story begin to develop that shaped the self-understanding of those that shared the worship of God. Reflecting on this development, Peterson observes that when we get caught up in a story, if it is a truthful story, we do not know how it might end or who else will become part of the story. The storied character of a congregation and the storied character of our lives are inextricably interrelated as they involve discoveries we had not anticipated, discoveries that occur through our living together. Peterson is candid that the church that was coming into being was not an ideal church, but a church made up of human beings. They were people who became ill and died, and those illness and deaths became part of the story that made Christ our King, the body of Christ. Peterson observes that this reality was made possible because the stories that constitute Christ our King Church provided a language in which everyone is organically related to the discoveries of patterns and meanings, beauty and truth and goodness, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in the seemingly random and disconnected pieces of experience and dreams, tasks and songs, promises and betrayals that made up daily life, words and sentences, detect and fashion stories and places of hospitality. I should like to think that the church Peterson describes is one I'm trying to imagine 25 years ago in Suffering Presence. Physicians and patients, whether they are Christians or not, find that we are increasingly trapped in a medical system that is not sustainable and may well be self-destructing. So we have little to lose if Christians begin to try to imagine what it would mean to form our care of one another through a medicine that, for God's sake, respects the body that is storied by Christ. Thank you very much.